So today I was thinking what to present you, because before I have introduced in the summer school other type of research that I'm also doing, but it is a part of my main research activities, which are related mainly to strategic management and corporate finance. And today I will introduce our research group, our international project first. But my first idea was to show you the emerging area. It's really not very conventional the way we approach this problem, and compared to what majority of scholars do in this field. So, as I said, we have an international research project that is supported by our university, by HEC, but also it is now supported by Russian Science Foundation. I will show you our projects and how we were evolving during this time. We have started with the research line, which now we are calling strategies for intangibles in large corporations. So our idea was to understand what is the role of new type of resources which are not introduced in the balance sheet of the companies, but everybody knows that they exist. So intangibles, intellectual resources, somebody call it intellectual capital. But we were focusing on companies, on big companies, and mainly European companies from 5 larger European countries is UK, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. And we have created a database. Today I will show you this data. So it's really, as I said, it's not a very conventional approach to how to collect data for this kind of research problem. Then we have discovered that intangibles is really very particular type of resources. It's very difficult to measure them, and there is no, let's say, universal approach how to do that. Majority of scholars, they use surveys, because so the value of these resources is not introduced, as I said, in companies' corporate reports, and so it's very difficult to measure them just looking on how company operates. The most obvious approach is just to ask managers, ask people in the companies, ask some other stakeholders outside companies, how company intensify intangible resources and which kind of resources are created and generated there. But we have decided not to do that. So we understand that surveys, so there are really good surveys that have very valid justification of these measurements, but still we have decided not to do that. But we stay just with publicly accessible data. So we are just trying to understand what is the information field in which companies operate and how they disclose about the activities, about the resources in this field. And we try to catch this information and to measure. So the second line that we have launched in our laboratory is measuring and evaluation of intangible resources. And of course, so far we have different metrics, different approaches how to do that. And most of these approaches are validated empirically. So we have shown that these metrics really can measure what we would like to measure with that. So the third research line was actually experimental research, but now we have 20 people in the laboratory, and all of them somehow are involved in this research line. So it's really interesting. It is about sport economics, but we are focusing on intangible resources. So even me, I was the last one who was not in this topic, started to write paper this year. And the first project, which is supported by Russian Science Foundation, it sounds like competitiveness of Russian companies. It was very much relevant to the time when we have applied to this project, because we have mentioned import substitution conditions, and that was exactly at the time when a lot of policies were introduced in import substitution. But we emphasize the role of intangibles. So our idea is that the main reason, the main origin of low competitiveness of Russian companies on international arena is related to the lack of intangible endowment that they have. So today I'm going to present one of the papers that we have actually started 3 years ago. It is based on our European database, and it is related mainly to this line, partially to the line of measuring and evaluation of intangibles. So at this example, I will try to introduce you how we approach our research topic. So just some few words about our laboratory. So it's international because we have 4 international professors there. Now we also have 1 PhD student who is from Brasilia but studying in Spain. So you see that we have 3 professors from Spain, 1 from US, but core of our laboratory, of course, is located in HEC in one of the campuses. So far is in Perm, but now we are trying to introduce it also in St. Petersburg. So that is the network of our laboratory. Why I show that? So you see that some connections with co-authors are really strong. So it is according to the number of projects and papers that they are elaborating together. But what is important, so our main technology, how we try to develop our young researchers, which are from HEC, so we try to connect them with all the rest. So we try to launch as much project as we can. So practically everybody has certain project on different level of development. And so me and my supervisor, we have a special project which is related to intangibles and crisis. And today I will present one of the papers which is related to that. So because my PhD thesis was with the focus on crisis of 2008 and 2009. And really I think that is one of the way to work with the topic related to corporate data. And I will show you why. So what is intangibles and intellectual resources? How do we define that? Actually, there is very large literature on that. And this literature is both from intellectual capital, it's an emerging area, from strategic management, from accounting, from economics. In economics, actually, intangibles is much more used than intellectual resources. But now the most common interpretation of intellectual resources is everything that related to knowledge, to experience, to innovations, to human capital, knowledge about market, knowledge about technologies, everything that companies accumulate. So you understand that it's very heterogeneous portfolio of resources. But of course, you have somehow to analyze that. In order to analyze that, you have to give a certain structure, at least a structure. And one of the most common structure of intellectual resources, which was published first in 1997, now everybody is using more or less this structure, is related to 3 types of capital. Is relational capital, human capital, and structural capital. So just a few words, what does it mean? So everybody knows what is human capital. Everybody thinks that they know what is human capital. Actually, there are a lot of perspectives. And usually when we talk about intellectual resources, people relate that to human capital because intellectual process is usually related to human brain. But actually, human capital is just part, sometimes not even a big part of companies' intangibles. Why do you think human capital actually is not so significant when it comes to companies' resources? Any ideas?
Because human capital shifts?
Yes, because yes, one of the reasons why human capital actually is often not so significant when we talk about portfolio of intangibles, because human capital doesn't belong actually to the company. And only so if you have experienced people that have knowledge related to the sphere that they are, it doesn't mean that they are eager to give this knowledge to the company and that they want to contribute the efforts. And even if they contribute the efforts today, it doesn't mean that they will do that tomorrow, because they can just go to another company. So just a part of human capital which is related to those created resource that cannot be taken off from the company, we can call human capital, and I will stay with that when I'm going to talk about measurements. So then we have relational capital. Actually, it is one of the most heterogeneous intellectual resources of the company, because companies have a lot of relations. But here we are talking only about external relations, because internal relations are more associated with human capital, to social, so we can relate that to social capital. But everything that is outside, so that means competitors, partners, suppliers, government, everything that outside is relational capital. And of course, in corporations, because we are going to talk about corporations, also relationship with investors, because investors are also outside. Even so, they can be partially involved in companies' management. And the last one is structural capital. Also very heterogeneous, but here usually we are talking about two types of structural capital. It's about innovations, so everything that company has created as new knowledge, new product, new technologies, etc. And the second part is related actually to the part of knowledge and human capital that will stay in the company even if all the human capital is decided to go out. So it means that everything that will stay in the company after we don't have any relation and any people. So that is structural capital. So it means that any information system that we have created and implemented, strategy, different standards of quality, whatever. So a lot of things that are like, they are for to make companies stable. And now, few words about our approach to measure that. As I said, we are not conducting surveys. We are just trying to get information from the open data. So, what is the main principle of our measurement? We take data probably that don't allow us to go very deep in companies' activities. Because, for example, let's talk about human capital. We look at the qualification and experience of top management. So, of course, it doesn't mean that if you have more qualified managers, that these managers will steer companies better compared to those that are less experienced and less qualified. But what we see is the relative difference in qualification and the share of qualified managers, and also their position, if they are independent or dependent directors in the company. Cost of employee, it doesn't also give us much information about how much do we invest in our human capital, because in cost of employees we have salaries, we have also cost for trainings and many other costs that can be related to human capital development. But again, what we can see is the dynamic of cost of employees, and also what we can see is the relative share of this cost of employee in the total cost of company. Also, corporate university. Actually, I'm planning to present tomorrow a paper about corporate universities, very special entity when it comes especially to Russian market. But so corporate university also, we don't know if it's good or bad. We just see that this corporate university is presented in companies' structure. But so, and we observe that for many companies, and we can compare how this corporate university can be transformed in their performance. So, and that is related to most of the measurements that you can see here. What is also important that some of our measurements, like for example, site quality. So it is quite subjective, site quality, but in many researches, in many studies that are related to intellectual capital, we can see that employees of the company are asked how do they consider site of the company is working, if it's useful or not, should it be improved or not. So in our case, we are not asking. In our case, We are just using a very narrow group of experts that are trying to evaluate to very strict criteria if this site is can be assigned with a certain level of quality. And not just level of quality, but also we try to position that inside the sector, inside the industry when we are looking for. Also, we have several issues about corporate governance. It's also subjective, but again, it is measured, maybe it's measured with the wrong ruler, but what is important, that is measured with the same ruler for all companies. And in this case, comparative studies are more appropriate. So, metrics for performance. Here, we also using not very conventional metrics, because usually when we talk about performance, it's related either to company's profit, productivity. Sometimes we talk about sales, which is, of course, not very good measurement when we try to analyze intangibles. So in our study, we are mainly focused on two characteristics. Economic value added. I don't know if you're familiar with this metric, but actually it comes from economic profit, which you can see in many very similar papers and books from economics. So economic profit is just profit that you gain from the activities minus all alternative costs that are brought when you decided to invest or you decided to choose this type of activities. And market value added, which is of course related because market value added by definition is based on the forecast of the future economic value added. But what is important that market value added can be observed every day. So market value added is a difference between market price and price for company's assets. It's a market price not just for company's share, but also for company's debts. So our data. We are collecting data for our studies starting from 2010. And we had already, so this year is the fifth wave of data collection. So we have panel structure and we have two main data sets. First is about European companies. So here we have about 1,600 companies, and we observed them in the recent version. It is from 2004 till 2015. And you see that what is important that this data set is representative for European Union. So here UK is just is in European Union, and understand that now is changing, but still it is representative because it covers 70, these 5 countries, they cover 70% of European Union economy. And also we have kept the same structure of industries and countries like it is presented in these countries. The second data set is on Russian companies. We have started to collect that a bit later. So we have unfortunately missed very important period before crisis. So we cannot register some data which are still important for us. But it covers the same period. Just some of the indicators that I have presented, they cannot be, so they are the same for the whole period because we have started to collect it late. So we have also 20 years, a little bit different sources of information. But what is important for Russian companies, that among more than 1,000 listed companies, just 150 are traded. Why we are focusing on traded companies, on listed companies? Because they have to disclose the information. Though they have, apart from voluntary disclosure that we are, of course, using, they have to disclose information. So in this case, of course, data availability is much much greater. But also they have information about market value added. That is one of the main indicators that we use to understand how intangibles are in long term recognized by investors. So here are some statistics. That is the dynamics of market value added by countries compared to the average level. So we have the same, but estimated not by mean but median to exclude outliers. So the picture is more or less the same, but what you can see that just two countries generally outperform average level. So it's France and United Kingdom, sometimes Germany. Spain and Italy and Russia, of course, are always under this line. If it comes to economic value added, here the picture is less representative. So here actually we cannot say which countries among those who are under this line really outperform in terms of competitive advantages, because economic value added actually introduces this concept of competitive advantages. So it is like long-term advantages that company has created, and now it is registered by this economic profit. So here you see, for example, that was really surprisingly for us that Spain is still very low. So they are talking about already the progress in recovery process of the crisis. So of course the crisis was prolonged in this country, but still you see that they are even significantly lower than Russia. So let's talk about our paper, because I think that I have spent like 20 minutes telling you about this, telling you introduction. So here is our paper that we have started 3 years ago. So now we have a lot of things that maybe we should reconsider. So I would love to have your comments. But I have just got the information this week that it was accepted in the journal. But again, we have room for improvement. And even I understand now that we have a lot of things to do here. So in our paper, we have focused on the recovery process, because at the moment when we have started it, as I said 3 years ago, it was 2014, there were many papers. Really, it was a huge amount of papers about crisis, mainly about crisis on financial market, in banking, in international finance, but also there were a lot of papers that appeared about crisis and its influence on performance of companies, of course, and their activities. So our idea was to understand what was the role of intangible-driven performance, and what was actually the role, the strategies, intangible-intensive strategies in companies when they were not in the epicentric of the crisis, but in aftermath, when they were trying to accelerate their recovery process. So here, actually, that was an attempt to do this short presentation for one slide. Here are the main findings of our paper. So I wanted to start with that, and then I will talk about some details. So you see that we have analyzed the period from 2007 to 2013. So we cover 3 periods: before crisis, crisis, and after crisis. And what is important in all corporate data that I wanted to emphasize, that is practically impossible to find something that is exogenous. So everything is absolutely endogenous. So the only thing that you can do when you estimate, for example, production function, when you estimate how your resources are transformed into performance, the only thing you can do is to try to statistically prove or to prove on the level of pre-estimation that there is some exogeneity that might bring you some new insights. So in our case, what we have done, so having, of course, panel data, we have more opportunities to at least not to mitigate totally, but at least try to deal with heterogeneity. So you see that when we look on the pre-crisis period here, we don't have the whole period is starting from 2004. There is and we compare two types of companies. It is intangible-intensive companies in red and non-intangible-intensive companies in blue. And if we compare them, there is no significant difference between these two subsamples in terms of market value added. So no matter how we classify them, so we had done some robustness check, there is no significant difference. So they were like rising and falling almost following the same trend without any difference in means or variation. But then we have seen crisis. And in second year of the crisis, it is the first period when we have started to observe some heterogeneity in this data. So that makes us think that probably crisis as an absolutely exogenous interference to these companies can be considered as the exogenous shock that made these companies a little bit different. And then we can see that after this period, after crisis, this difference is even expanding. So we have analyzed three types of strategies. Actually, it is according to this classification that I have introduced before. So in that sense, we just stay with the very traditional way to classify intangibles. And we have tried to identify those companies that are intensive in structural capital. Some people also call it organizational capital, in human capital and in relational capital. And we have found out that a bit more than I think 60% of companies, they follow one of these strategies. Of course, there is also a combination I will show you. And about 40%, they are not intensive in any of these strategies. So it is more or less homogeneous data set. And our idea was to understand if this group of companies together or separately can outperform dynamically those companies that we consider as a control group. In our case is non-intensive non-intangible intensive companies. So that was in brief what we have actually all the steps of our study. So I said that important issue that we would like to understand if companies intensify intangibles and some companies don't intensify intangibles, they try to use these advantages in order to create value in the future. And of course, when they face crisis, they would like to recover faster. That is the main purpose of any companies when they are in troubles. As I said, there is a cap of the literature because there is a lot of studies about crisis and no studies at that moment. So now we have some newer papers, working papers, especially about crisis aftermath, but all these papers, they were about crisis, not about a period when companies were actually growing. As I said, there's lack of the literature. Also, we had some previous studies. As I said, I have done my PhD about this topic, and of course, I had papers before we have started doing that. So that was a paper about dynamic of intellectual during the crisis. So that was until 2009. Also, we have analyzed company strategies, and we were trying to understand how company strategies could protect, that is what more exploratory study, could protect companies and make them to be, let's say, less suffered, less impacted by crisis compared to their competitors. So key findings from these studies that intangibles are more important during the crisis compared to prosperity period. Also that conservative intangible intensive strategy. So here we have called conservative strategy and the counterpart is innovative strategy. Conservative strategy is relatively more successful. still more successful, both on European and Russian market. And but innovative strategy was more successful in some in first 2 years during the crisis. But now I will show you that is not always that was not sustainable for the whole period of recovery. So the intuition, intangibles constitute companies' advantages, and they try to use these advantages when they are recovering, of course. So how do we measure recovery speed? First, because it's very important, as I said, we are looking for the dynamics. Recovery speed and recovery acceleration. Why do we consider both concepts? So we believe that it's not just important to see the, let's say, the linear trend of how companies were recovering, but also for us it's important that companies could accelerate their recovery process from year to year. Because especially in the first years after crisis, it's very important to use more opportunities because they get additional benefits compared to those who don't have acceleration but just are supporting average trend. That's why acceleration process was very important for us to study. So the identification of the model, recovery speed is just difference between market value added, and we identify the following model. So we try to estimate this interaction term that we introduce with the intangible-intensive strategy. So we try to understand how much intangible-intensive strategy in these some samples were relatively more successful compared to the rest. And of course, we control for everything that we can. The recovery acceleration is the second derivative, and we estimate the following model. So what is very important is to identify strategies. And in our study, as I said, we have identified 3 strategies based on the data of European companies. So here are our strategies. How do we identify a strategy which is intensive in structural capital? So for us it's important high value of intangible assets, so those companies that have relatively higher level of intangible assets, companies that have patents and the number again higher than average representative of the industry, that they have implement corporate strategy. Again, we always compared with companies in the same industry with the same size, with the same number of employees and fixed assets. So how do we identify that companies are intensive in human capital? As I said, it has to have higher, relatively higher qualification of management. We say that these companies should have corporate universities, and actually in European data we have quite good number of these companies. But also what is important, that we are looking for the companies that simultaneously increase cost per employee and number of employees. So it means that they increase salaries and they increase training costs per one employee. But at the same time they extend their human capital. So, and the last one is companies that are intensive in relational capital. As I said, is very heterogeneous, so we try to put everything that we could measure. So first it is employment of foreign capital for European companies. Of course, we can observe a majority of companies that have foreign capital because Europe is very much integrated. But also what is important for us, that the headquarters is located in a big city, and they are very widely represented in internet. So it means that they have good website, they have a lot of citations, and always we are comparing to the analogs which having the same type of activities and the same scale of activities. So we have seen the following distribution. As I said, about 40% have non-intensive strategy, from 15 to 25%, they're allocated between these three strategies. Also, for the robustness check, and also to show that really these companies, they are not heterogeneous, not significantly different in their performance on average, we have compared that to those companies that are intensive in all type of intangibles. It's just 2%. And for this 2%, actually, we have seen very significantly different performance. So these companies cannot be analyzed, at least in the framework that we are introducing. Also, we have, again, for the robustness, we have analyzed companies that are intensive at least in two types of intangibles in different combination. Again, we have seen that these companies are better off compared to average company. But these companies are very similar. I mean, on average, they are very similar. So here is our estimations. So we have used lagged variables to estimate the relative trends for each group of the companies, for recovery speed and for acceleration. So I will not stay with the tables. I will move to key findings that we have found. So first of all, intangible-intensive strategies provided moderation of the recovery. So it means that the speed is really higher. It is how I have showed you on the scheme in the first slide. Second, speed of the recovery was unstable. So it means on average it's really higher, but what we could see that each year was different from another. So we could say that for intangible-intensive strategies, we could observe really acceleration process. So it's not linear. Acceleration was clearly higher for companies that are intensive in structural and human capital among those that we have analyzed. And relational capital moderated speed in short term, but the acceleration process was not so clear. So we cannot draw any conclusion about that. So that is the end of my presentation. Again, this slide, and I'm open for your questions. Thank you.
So, Elena, thank you for your presentation. I've got a question about your control variables regarding the your enterprises. Did you control for the sector,
yes,
industry, size of the enterprises, and so on, because it's really important? And
yeah.
I have a comment on human capital. There is very high job mobility in Russia between companies. And
it's not Russia. It was Europe.
All entire data was European.
Yes.
But you said you.
Yes, we have data set on Russian companies, but it's not in this paper.
Okay, then just about controls on your variables.
Yeah, so actually we have introduced different control variables in different specifications, again, for robustness check. Of course, we have controlled for industry. In some specification also we have controlled for short fixed effect, because we have long panel, we have separated in sub panels, and we have introduced fixed effect of companies. So in this case we don't introduce sector, but fixed effect of the companies. It's also the way to control for indigeneity. And yes, so also we have fixed asset, we had number of employees. So here not number of employees, because it was to identify strategy.
Hi, so this is just about the data. Do the companies have an incentive to misreport the data?
So I wouldn't say that they have incentives to misreport. I would say that they have different incentives to disclose this data. So when we talk about, of course, so the reports of these companies that are listed, they also have mandatory auditing process. So in that sense, we can rely at least on financial data and the corporate reports. But also we have, of course, information that is not presented there, for example, about company strategy. So we try to do that using some markers of corporate strategy, which is also introduced in corporate reports and websites. But of course, here we could have some bias.
Since what you're calling human capital for the firm is what Williamson, I guess, would call asset-specific human capital. So in other words, things you learn that are not valuable in another firm. I wonder if that's part of a strategy of vertical integration. So have you tried to correlate the degree of vertical integration and other margins with the extent of asset-specific human capital?
No. In our data, we don't have data about vertical. So we have actually, as we observe the same companies, and of course, if they pass through MA process, so we could see this data because they are registered. But I understand that this vertical integration can be different. So now we are actually trying to look at networks in board of directors of companies, because it's also the way to be integrated, usually vertically integrated, when the same people are presented in the boards of different companies which are introduced in different sectors, which act in different sectors. So now we're trying to catch this information from this connection between boards, but it's not in this paper.
But you see the problem, right? Sometimes they may have more workers with intangible human capital because they are engaged in processes where the quality of labor becomes more robust as a result of this intangible human capital. In contrast, there may be other firms that vertically integrate on different dimensions, a la Williamson, because of some inefficiency in the structure of the outside market, and so that they cannot go to an outside party. There does not exist a pre-existing market, or there are inefficiencies in the local economy. And so then there's a bigger incentive to have intangible human capital, especially in parts of Europe with very high minimum wages. And even in the same country, the gap between the minimum wage and the true wage, market wage in that specific region may force different types of vertical integration, and you may be picking some of this up.
Thank you. No, I agree with you. Really, it's a very important issue, but actually our message, our main idea was that we can say that to be intensive in human capital is bad or is good. So we just try to understand if you are already intensive, no matter which reasons has driven you to be intensive in human capital or in other type of capitals, but then suddenly something exogenously happened, like crisis, and we just see if after this exogenous negative shock, company can use this created opportunities generated before, or that they follow to generate after they, the crisis is disappearing, so they have opportunity to raise again.
No, but you see the problem. Let's make it extreme. Let's assume the only reason you have more intangible human capital is because you're vertically integrated. And you're vertically integrated because you're less integrated into both the local, the national, and the world economy. And one of the things we observed in the crisis of 2008 and 2009 is that countries that were less, so this is for countries, not for companies, countries that were less integrated in globalization suffered less, but they were actually less efficient. Right? And so what you may be observed, that's my point. My point is that it's not clear you can make any inference about the role of intangibles. What you're observing, therefore, is a proxy for vertical integration, which is actually a proxy for the lack of efficiency of either the firm or the institutions or that specific region. And with only one shock, it is impossible to sort out what
Yes, I understood. Thank you.
Thank you for this very nice presentation.